I knew something was wrong the moment the security guard looked at me with that quiet sympathy people use when they know a truth you don't want to hear. I had my jacket zipped tight, the envelope in my pocket soft from being held too long, and I told him my daughter was graduating today. He asked to see my ticket. I told him she said everything was taken care of. When he shook his head, I felt a sharp pull in my chest, the kind that makes you forget to breathe for a moment. He wasn't rude. He was gentle. But the answer was the same every time I asked. My name wasn't on any list. I wasn't cleared to enter. I stood there with people brushing past me, proud families holding flowers and signs, and I felt like a stranger in a place I thought I belonged. I stepped back from the line, trying to understand what happened. My hands were shaking even though the morning wasn't cold. I kept thinking maybe she left the ticket at the desk, or maybe there was a mistake. That kind of denial older parents know too well. The instinct to protect your child, even when you're the one being hurt. I walked around the edge of the building and found a spot where I could see students gathering. The colors of their gowns moved together like one large wave. I searched for her face, hoping she would turn toward me, maybe wave, maybe notice I wasn't inside. Instead, I saw her laughing with her friends, standing close, talking fast, full of excitement. She looked happy. She also looked like someone who didn't want me there. I called her name once, not loud, just enough for my own ears to hear. She didn't turn. She didn't even glance in my direction. She held her phone up, taking pictures with the group. It hit me then, harder than I expected, that she knew I had come. She knew what this day meant to me, yet she didn't give me a way in. I felt the truth land on me slowly, like a weight settling on my back. She didn't want me in that auditorium. She didn't want me in that moment of her life. I didn't want to make a scene. So I walked back to the parking lot and stood next to my car. From there, I could see part of the stage through the open doors when people moved. I watched the ceremony from that distance, listening to the muffled applause and the announcements. Parents around me were inside cheering for their children, while I held onto the edge of my car door to keep myself steady. I kept telling myself this must be a misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something between us had broken long before today. And I had ignored the signs because I didn't want to face them. When they called her name, I heard the crowd respond, and I whispered, "That's my daughter," even though no one was there to hear it. I stayed until the very end, long after most families had driven away. I didn't understand how we reached this point, or why she felt I didn't deserve a seat inside. All I knew was that I stood in that parking lot, watching from a distance, wondering when I stopped being welcome in my own child's life. I think the part that hurts the most is knowing it didn't fall apart overnight. It slipped away year by year, almost like watching a light fade without noticing how dim the room has become until you're standing in the dark. When she was little, she ran to me for everything. I taught her how to ride her bike, bandaged her knees, helped with school projects. She used to fall asleep against my shoulder during long drives home. Those memories feel almost unreal now, as if they belonged to another life. I held on to them for too long, hoping they would guide us back, but they only made the distance feel sharper as she grew older and colder. The first signs were small. She began answering my calls with short replies, like talking to me was something she needed to get through. "I'm busy, Dad," she would say, or "I'll call you later." The calls never came. I tried not to take it personally, telling myself she was becoming independent, building her own world. I didn't want to be the father who clung too tightly. So I gave her space. But space kept turning into silence, and silence turned into a wall I couldn't see over. I remember one afternoon when I asked if she wanted to come by for dinner. She used to love sitting at the table with me, listening to old stories about her mother. But that day she sighed into the phone and said she had other plans. The way she said it made me feel like I was asking for something unreasonable. I let it go, telling myself she was tired. That kind of excuse becomes a pattern when you're trying to protect your heart. You start explaining away things you should be paying attention to. You pretend it's normal for a child to stop showing interest. You act like the hurt doesn't burn you from the inside. Then came the new friend she kept mentioning, someone she met at work, someone who seemed to comment on every choice she made. She spoke about him with a strange mix of admiration and dependence, as if she suddenly needed approval from a person she barely knew. I noticed her opinions changing, her tone shifting. This friend questioned why she spent so much time helping me with errands. He told her she needed to set boundaries, that young adults shouldn't be tied down by aging parents. She repeated those phrases to me, word for word, and each time it felt like a door closing. Still, I tried to stay patient. I kept offering help, checking in, reminding her I was still here. She thanked me less often. She visited less. Once, when I asked if everything was all right between us, she hesitated long enough to tell me the truth without speaking. I knew she was slipping away, but I didn't know how to pull her back without making things worse. That is a kind of helplessness older parents know too well. You see the change, but you can't name it, and you're scared that acknowledging it will push them farther. By the time I realized something serious was being hidden, it was already too late. She avoided direct questions, brushed off real concerns, and kept her life sealed behind vague explanations. I felt the distance growing like a quiet warning in my chest. I didn't want to believe she could ever shut me out completely. But standing in that parking lot on graduation day, I understood these moments weren't random. They were steps leading to a place where I no longer had a seat in her life. I didn't start worrying about my accounts until a small withdrawal showed up one morning while I was paying bills. It wasn't much, just enough to make me pause, but I knew I hadn't taken that money out. At first, I thought it was a bank error. Mistakes happen, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But when I checked the rest of the month's activity, there were several more withdrawals I couldn't explain. They were spaced apart just enough to look harmless. Together, they felt like a message I wasn't ready to read. I sat at my kitchen table, trying to steady my breathing as I scrolled through the statements again. Something was happening without my knowledge, and the confusion settled deep in my stomach. I called my daughter to ask if she knew anything about it. I didn't accuse her of anything. I only asked if she had used the card by mistake. Her voice tightened right away. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded cornered. "Why are you asking me this?" she said, as if the question itself was an attack. I told her I just wanted to understand the missing money. She snapped back that she was busy and didn't have time for every little worry. I tried to explain how unsettling it felt, but she talked over me, insisting I must have forgotten making the withdrawals. That response cut deeper than she understood. I may be older, but I am not confused. Her tone turned sharp enough to end the call. When she hung up, I was left staring at the phone, feeling a cold wave of dread pushing against my ribs. In the days that followed, she became even harder to reach. Calls went to voicemail. Texts were answered hours later, if at all. When she did reply, her messages were short and distant, like she didn't want anything in writing. I kept trying to tell myself there was a harmless explanation, but her sudden silence said otherwise. The timing was too perfect. The friend she admired so much had been talking about financial freedom and managing your resources during their last visit. I remembered him saying older people didn't understand how money worked anymore. He said it with a smile, but the meaning behind it felt sharp. Now, those words returned to me with a sting I couldn't shake. I went back to my bank and printed out the statements. I placed them in a folder so I could track everything. I wrote the dates down in a small notebook, listing each missing amount beside them. I didn't want to forget anything, not because of age, but because something told me I needed to protect myself. Keeping notes gave me a strange sense of control. It also made me realize how vulnerable I had become without noticing. I had always trusted my daughter, always believed she would stand by me, but trust felt dangerous now, like something that could be used against me if I didn't stay alert. More withdrawals appeared the next week, larger ones, enough to make me sit still for a long time, staring at the numbers as the truth crept closer. Someone was taking advantage of me. Someone close enough to know I wouldn't check every day. I didn't want to believe it was her, but every sign pointed in the same direction. She had pulled away emotionally, and now something was pulling at my finances. I felt the betrayal growing, not as a sharp pain, but as a slow, heavy pressure that made every breath feel measured. I didn't confront her again right away. I needed to understand what I was dealing with, but in my heart, I knew this wasn't random. Financial silence is often the first warning sign. I just never expected it to come from my own child. It became clear something deeper was happening when she began controlling when I could see her. Before, even when she was distant, she still picked up the phone or stopped by if I asked. But after the questions about my bank account, everything changed. She started saying she was too busy to visit, or that she was out of town, even when I could hear familiar sounds in the background. When I asked if we could have dinner together, she told me she needed emotional space. as if a simple meal with her father was too heavy to handle. Every excuse carried the same message. I wasn't supposed to be part of her daily life anymore. Soon, she wasn't just limiting visits. She began restricting decisions I had always made for myself. One afternoon, she called and told me she had spoken to someone at her job about helping older parents with their finances. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. She said I should think about signing papers to let her manage things more smoothly. When I asked what she meant, she mentioned power of attorney like it was nothing more than a helpful tool. I told her I wasn't ready for something like that, and the shift in her tone was instant. She sounded annoyed, like I was making her life harder by wanting control over my own affairs. That reaction left me uneasy in a way I hadn't felt before. Days passed, and more red flags began appearing. She missed a doctor's appointment she promised to take me to, then blamed me for not reminding her. Another time, a piece of mail I needed to sign arrived already opened. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off and said she was trying to help. She started locking her phone during visits, typing quickly when she thought I wasn't looking. When I tried to ask simple questions, she became defensive, almost angry, as if curiosity itself was an offense. It felt like she was building a life around me, not with me. With every unanswered call, the fear of losing my independence grew stronger. I found myself checking locks twice at night and reviewing small things I never used to worry about. I didn't know what she might try next, and the uncertainty wore me down. I caught myself holding my breath when the phone rang, afraid of what she would ask for or accuse me of. She had become unpredictable, and unpredictability at my age feels like danger. I thought about reaching out for help more than once. I even considered going to a lawyer or a counselor just to understand what my options were. But each time I reached for the phone, guilt pulled me back. She was still my daughter. I kept telling myself she might be stressed or misled. I didn't want to believe she was capable of hurting me. That hesitation held me in place while the situation around me tightened. Looking back, every sign was right in front of me. But when the person raising those signs is your own child, you question your instincts instead of their actions. Would you see these as red flags? I reached the point where I couldn't ignore the fear anymore. I woke up one morning and realized I was checking my bank account before I even made coffee. I was living in a state of quiet panic, always waiting for the next surprise withdrawal. That was when I decided I needed help. Not emotional support, not reassurance. Real, legal help from someone who could tell me the truth without trying to spare my feelings. I searched for a local attorney who worked with elder cases, and I made the earliest appointment they had. Saying the words out loud to the receptionist felt like admitting something heavy. I think someone might be taking money from me. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, I felt like I was carrying every worry on my shoulders. The room was calm and quiet, and the lawyer spoke in a steady voice that made me feel safe enough to hand over the folder I had been putting together. Inside were my bank statements, the notes I had written, and copies of recent mail that didn't look right. He took his time flipping through each page. I watched his face carefully, hoping to see some sign that I was wrong. Instead, his expression hardened in a way that confirmed what I had been afraid to say myself. He looked up and told me these withdrawals were not normal. Some were too frequent. Others were placed at times I could prove I was home. He explained that unauthorized access to an account can be a sign of financial exploitation, especially when the pattern is small amounts that grow slowly over time. Hearing those words made my hands shake, not because I didn't believe him, but because having it confirmed by a professional made everything feel painfully real. I wasn't imagining it. Something was happening to me, and it had been happening for a while. He asked if anyone else had access to my cards or passwords. I hesitated before saying my daughter's name. Even then, I felt guilt creep into my voice, as if I was accusing her of something unforgivable. He didn't judge me for that hesitation. He told me parents often struggle to accept the possibility of abuse from their own children. He explained that officials take these concerns seriously, especially when the victim is older and the pattern shows planning rather than chance. His calm way of speaking gave me a sense of authority I didn't know I needed. He contacted someone from a local agency that works with elder protection. They reviewed the documents as well and said the same thing. The signs pointed toward abuse. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't harmless help. It was exploitation of someone who trusted too easily. Hearing that made me feel both relieved and frightened. Relieved because the confusion that had weighed on me for weeks finally had a name. Frightened because naming it meant there would be consequences, and consequences meant conflict with my own child. The lawyer laid out the next steps. He said we had enough to open a formal investigation and that officials would handle it slowly and carefully. Nothing would happen overnight, and nothing would be done without my consent. I agreed to move forward because I couldn't keep living in fear. As I signed the first document authorizing them to begin, I felt a small spark of strength return. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even confidence. It was the simple feeling of taking back something that had been slipping away. Walking out of the office, I knew my life was about to change, and not in a way I ever wanted. But I also knew I wasn't helpless anymore. Have you ever had to protect an elder legally? I asked her to come over one evening because I needed to look her in the eye. I couldn't keep carrying the weight of silence, not after the lawyer laid out everything so clearly. When she walked through the door, she didn't greet me the way she used to. She stood with her arms crossed, her face closed off, like she had already decided the conversation was an inconvenience. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to speak calmly. I told her I had gone to a lawyer about the withdrawals and the missing money. I said I needed answers from her, not excuses. She didn't show shock. She didn't even pretend. Instead, she rolled her eyes and said I was overreacting again. She claimed older people often forget transactions and that I shouldn't jump to conclusions. The way she said it felt like a slap. I reminded her of the amounts, the dates, and how I had written everything down as it happened. She brushed it off, insisting she knew nothing about it. When I pressed further, she turned hostile, saying she was tired of my constant suspicion and that I was ruining her peace with my worries. I slid the folder across the table. Inside were the bank statements, my notes, and the official summary from the Elder Protection Agency. She stared at it for only a moment before pushing it away like it was trash. I told her this wasn't a misunderstanding. I told her the investigation had already begun and the truth would come out. Hearing that made her face twist with anger. She accused me of betraying her, of listening to outsiders who wanted to turn us against each other. Her voice stayed sharp, but there was fear behind it. That fear told me more than her words ever could. I opened one of the pages and pointed to a withdrawal made at a time I was at home recovering from a medical appointment. I had proof I couldn't have made it. My daughter's expression changed for just a second, long enough for me to see guilt break through. Then she hardened again. She blamed her friend, said he might have used my card by accident. But the charges were too deliberate, too consistent. When I told her that officials were now involved, she stepped back as if she had been cornered. In that moment, something inside me broke in a way I can't describe. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and final. I realized she wasn't going to admit anything. She wasn't going to apologize or show remorse. She was choosing lies over truth and herself over me. The distance between us wasn't emotional anymore. It was moral. I felt a cold, heavy clarity settle in my chest. Whatever bond we had left was gone. Before I could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. 2 officers and the investigator entered, calm and professional. They had come to speak with her about the findings and to ask her questions directly. She looked at me with disbelief, as if I had planned this moment to punish her. I didn't. It was simply the result of her own choices catching up to her. She tried to argue with them, but the evidence was stronger than her denials. As they explained next steps and her rights, she stopped looking at me altogether. I stood there, steady but hollow, realizing I was watching the last piece of our relationship crumble. I didn't feel anger in that moment. I felt something heavier, final acceptance. The truth had taken away any place for hope to hide. Would you cut ties at this point? The charges came a week after the confrontation. I remember sitting at my kitchen table when the investigator called, his voice steady as he explained that the evidence was strong enough to move forward. Hearing the words financial exploitation used in an official setting made my chest tighten. It was one thing to suspect my own child, another to hear the state confirm it. They told me she would be notified formally and that a court date would follow. I sat there for a long time after the call ended, staring at the wall, letting the truth settle in a way it never had before. This wasn't a family argument. It was a crime. The first hearing felt unreal. I walked into the courtroom with my lawyer beside me, each step heavy but controlled. My daughter stood across the room with her, attorney, her face blank, her eyes avoiding mine. She didn't look scared or sad. She looked angry, angry that she had been caught, angry that I hadn't stayed silent, angry that the world now knew what she had done. The judge began by listing the charges: fraud, unauthorized access to an elder's accounts, and deliberate financial exploitation. Hearing those words in that quiet room felt like a knife turning inside me. Yet there was a part of me that felt finally seen. Investigators took the stand first. They explained the pattern of withdrawals, the timing, and the false explanations she had given. They spoke calmly, without emotion, just facts laid out one by one. My daughter's attorney tried to argue confusion or misunderstanding, saying she only wanted to help me manage my money. But each claim fell apart when matched against the records. The amounts were too exact, the timings too controlled, the behavior too consistent to be anything other than planned. When they presented the summary of how much had been taken, my daughter finally showed something other than anger. She looked shaken, realizing the numbers were too large to explain away. Still, she tried. She said she took the money because she thought I didn't need it. She said her friend influenced her. She said she was under pressure. But even those explanations crumbled when the prosecutor pointed out that she had lied to me repeatedly, opened my mail, and tried to get me to sign documents, giving her full control over my assets. There was no saving her from the truth. The sentencing came after several long sessions. The judge spoke about trust, about duty, about how vulnerable adults depend on their children to protect them, not harm them. He said her actions showed intention and disregard. He ordered restitution for the money taken and issued a sentence that included supervised probation and mandatory financial ethics counseling. It wasn't a dramatic punishment. It wasn't meant to ruin her life. It was meant to hold her accountable and keep her away from my accounts forever. When the judge asked if I wanted to speak, I said only that I hoped she would understand the damage she caused, not just to my finances, but to something deeper inside me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I spoke quietly because the weight of the moment didn't need volume. It needed truth. As I walked out of the courtroom, there was no victory in me, no celebration, just a heavy, somber closure settling into my bones. Justice had been done, but it didn't mend anything. It only confirmed what had already been broken. Do you think the sentence was enough? Life after the trial moved quietly, almost like the world around me had turned down its volume. I didn't wake up with the same fear I used to, but I also didn't wake up with peace. I felt something in between, a slow settling of dust after a long storm. Some mornings were harder than others. I would reach for my phone and expect a message from her, even though I knew it wouldn't come. Old habits don't disappear just because the truth comes out. Loneliness filled the empty spaces she used to occupy, and I had to learn how to live with it without letting it swallow me. I spent more time at home, not out of fear, but because I needed the stillness to understand everything that had happened. I took small steps toward rebuilding my life. I organized my bills again, changed my banking information, and worked closely with the agency to make sure nothing else could be taken from me. These were actions I never thought I would need to take to protect myself from my own child. Yet doing them made me feel steady again. It reminded me that I still had control over my life, even if someone had tried to take it from me. When I sat alone in the evenings, I thought a lot about what parenthood really means. You raise a child with the hope that they grow kinder than the world around them. You give your time, your patience, your strength, and you never expect to be paid back. Love isn't a debt, but betrayal from your own child hits in a place no one warns you about. It strikes at your dignity, makes you question whether you failed them, or worse, whether they failed the part of themselves you once helped build. I didn't want to get lost in blame, but the question stayed with me like shadows that moved with the light. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the time she stole, the trust she broke long before a single dollar went missing. Trust is something you give freely as a parent, believing your child will treat it with care. When it is thrown aside, the wound doesn't close cleanly. It remains tender, no matter how much healing you try to do. I carried that reality with me, not as anger, but as a truth I had to accept to keep moving forward. Still, I found a quiet strength in knowing I stood up for myself. Many older people stay silent because they fear losing the little connection they have left. I understand that fear. I lived with it for years, but silence would have allowed the harm to continue, maybe grow even worse. Speaking up didn't save the relationship, but it saved me. It protected what remained of my life, my independence, and my dignity. I hope younger viewers hear this and understand what respect truly means. Elders are not burdens. We are not obstacles. We are people who gave decades of our lives to raise children who, we pray, will treat us with the same care one day. Betrayal from a parent's child leaves a wound that never fully heals, no matter how much time passes or how strong the justice system is. Some breaks stay broken. As for me, I live quietly now. I take walks, cook simple meals, and keep my home in order. I am not waiting for her to return, and I'm not holding on to anger. I am holding on to truth, because it is the only thing that never betrayed me.